everyone. My name is Jessica. I am a librarian with the Chelmsford Public Library. Today we present Maintain Your Bike, Maintain Your Sanity, Maintain Social Distance with MassBike. That's the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition. I'm very excited to welcome Galen Mook, who is the Executive Director of MassBike. If you're like me, bicycling has been one of the only things keeping you sane these days. In fact, one of the major accomplishments for our family during stay at home is that my almost 4-year-old is now on 2 wheels. So today we're very excited to welcome Galen Mook of MassBike into this virtual space to help us get our bikes in shape for the season. For those of you that don't know, Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition promotes a bicycle-friendly environment and encourages bicycling fun for fitness and transportation. Galen has been involved in MassBike since his days at Boston University, when he helped kickstart the bicycle advocacy movement by co-founding a student group, BU Bikes. Before taking the helm at MassBike, Galen worked at Landry's Bicycles in the advocacy and marketing department, and worked for the startup, the Hubway Bike Share Company, for the first 3 years of the program. Founded a community bike co-op nonprofit in Alston called Common Wheels, and has worked as a pedicabber and bicycle activist in the Boston area for over a decade. He especially enjoys teaching folks some of the basics of biking to break down barriers and get more folks riding and more bikes more often. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And now I'm going to hand it over to Galen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks to the Chelmsford Library for hosting this. We had this on the books to do in person. We were actually going to do a couple of sessions, even an on-bike, learn to ride skill set, but all that stuff is postponed. But I do want you to keep an eye out for some of the offerings from the Chelmsford Library in partnerships with MassBike. I am welcoming you to my laundry room in my basement, where we're going to do a little bit of bike repair today. A little bit about me, just to add on to the little preamble there. I've been at the helm of MassBike for just almost 2 years, a little more than a year and a half. I see a lot of your faces who I recognize in my gallery view right here. I'm really inspired that you've all joined us and are spending your time with us. I hope you are well. I hope you and your families are doing okay in the hunker down, stay at home orders. I look forward to the days when we can go out riding again. But in the meantime, MassBike is going to be offering some webinars and some at-home information to keep you encouraged about biking. And for those of you who are heading out on rides, maybe they're solo rides or maybe they're rides with just your quarantine family, do still take care out there. We encourage riding. We think it's one of the best ways to maintain your physical and mental wellness in these hard times. So I'm encouraged to keep in touch. Feel free to reach out to MassBike. And I would be remiss to say if I would not remind you that we are a member-driven organization. So if you are not a member, and I know many of you are already members, and I'm grateful and thankful for your contributions, but feel free, if you're so inspired, to hop onto massbike.org and become a member of the organization. We're going to be doing a lot of these webinars. I'll tell a little bit more about it towards the end. But we have a webinar on Monday about bike packing, which is going out with your bike and a camping gear and doing the Bay Circuit Trail, which is a trail that basically is a further out loop right through the backyard of Chelmsford. Actually starts up in Lowell and makes a loop all the way down and ends up in Duxbury, I believe. It's a off-road trail that you can take most of your mountain bike on. It's got some pavement. I think the Bruce Freeman is a part of it as well. We're going to be talking about national, regional, and local advocacy on the 27th with League of American Bicyclists, the Rails to Trails Conservancy, and East Coast Greenway, talking policy stuff. So all of you advocate wonks out there, we've got an offering for you. And more to come. We're probably going to have in the first week in June, a book reading on bicycle authors, historical and children's writers. So we're trying to get a variety of offerings out there so that we're still talking bikes, even if we're sitting in our basements doing our own bike ABCs. Today, we're going to talk about the very, very basics of bike mechanics. This is the how to do it yourself at home stuff that you'll need to check on your bike more or less every time before you hop on your bike and go for a ride. Now, there's a lot that we can cover with bike maintenance and bike repair. This is going to be very entry level. So this is probably a refresher for a lot of you, but maybe I'll be presenting it in a way that you hadn't thought about before, or it makes you think differently about how the brakes work, or how the tube and the pumping system works, or how the chain works. But again, this is like the entry level for those of you who are just pulling your bike out of the garage or the basement for the first time in a couple months to do this ABC check. Of course, I'll also recommend that if there's anything more extensive that you are unfamiliar with on your bike, your local bike shop is a resource. MassBike fought pretty hard at the beginning of the COVID shutdown to make sure that bicycle repair was considered an essential service, which after a little bit of back and forth with the governor's team, we were actually able to get bike repair designated. So I've been personally calling around the shops across Massachusetts to check in. I'd say all but one I've talked to is remaining open in some form or another. Some of them are doing curbside, some of them are doing pickup and drop off, mobile repairs, but your bike mechanics are out there. So if anything needs to be really overhauled, need new tires, need new chains, need to get your brakes more professionally looked at, rely on your local bike shop. Now that said, what I'm going to teach you today is going to be the very basics of what you should be doing by yourself
So we
as a
have this
DIY.
bike maintenance thing that I was.
Yep. And I also understand that there's going to be a little bit of technological hiccups throughout this, just because it's very awkward to do this through Zoom calls. So we're going to do the best we can to do it through a screen. If we were in person, I'd much prefer it because I could have you squeeze my tires to feel how hard they are, really squeeze the brakes and see the tension on the cables. So we're going to do the best we can to do this remotely. But that said, I'd encourage you to follow along at home if you have your bike. Your bike is not going to be the same as my bike. There's going to be different functionality, but we're going to cover the basics that probably would translate from my machine to your machine. And then, just as was mentioned earlier, if you wanted to type a question in the chat, we'll be monitoring the chat. And yes, and I see one here. Oh, masks. Oh, I guess I'm from Grant. There's one question already out there. My assumption with that question is, does Grant recommend that we wear masks when we ride? Yes, really, it's the governor's recommendation that anytime you're outdoors and going to be in a public space that you should have some sort of face covering. I like to call them face coverings, not necessarily masks. Masks have a little bit more of a robust meaning and implies you have to pay for it, but a face covering could be anything like a t-shirt that you cut up or something along those lines. But yeah, in this time, and I will not do too much of the COVID talk, but I'm happy to answer questions afterwards as well. But really just follow the guidelines that are coming from the governor and your local board of health. And they change day by day. So, but that said, enough preamble, let's start talking about the bike ABCs. All right, so I'll tell you about my bike right here. This is my Specialized stump jumper. A couple things about this bike. This is a mountain bike. And a couple ways I can tell it's a mountain bike are the fatter tires that are knobby. Wider tires mean a wider clearance on the frame so that the wheels can fit. It's got multiple gears. It's got a derailleur system with 3 gears in the front and I believe 7 gears in the back. This is probably from the mid-90s. It's a classic Specialized stump jumper. You can see that it's got a rigid, we call a rigid rear fork, rear triangle, but it's got shocks and suspension in the front. So it's actually made for going over some bumps, but not really doing too much like downhill mountain biking. It's got flat bars in the front, which means that they're horizontal. If you have a road bike, you might have handlebars that drop down, and we call them drops. And that has a vertical orientation in terms of the brake levers. This is a horizontal orientation for the brake levers. I have rim brakes. That means that the brakes actually stop on the rim of the wheel. Some brakes that you might have at home are disc brakes, which are more in the center of the wheel, in the hub of the wheel. We're not really going to be covering them too much, but I'll leave some time in the Q&A if anybody has any real questions about some of the other nuances of the different componentry. So horizontal bars, hand brakes, rim brakes that are cable activated. And by that, I mean that they do not use hydraulic fluid. Some brake lines use hydraulic fluid, like cars and motorcycles are hydraulic. These are cable. We'll talk about why that matters later. And I mentioned earlier that I've got the full gear system down here. This is multiple gears in the front, multiple gears in the rear, and we'll talk a little bit about cleaning the chain and the derailleur system as well. A couple other things about this bike, which might be different than yours. Mainly what we're going to talk mostly about is the wheel size and the wheel width. If you have a road bike, your wheels and your tires are much thinner and much skinnier than mine are. We'll talk about why that matters with tire pressure in a minute as well. If you're following along at home, I'll try to make this as universal as possible so that what I do on my bike, you can do on your bike. And again, I'm more than happy to check out some of the questions in the chat, and I'll try to wrap this up in about 45 minutes or so, 50 minutes to allow some really good time for quality Q&A. All right, so what we're going to cover today is the A, the B, and the C. Now, if we were in person, I would ask you, do you know what the ABCs are? Give you a second. It actually stands for the air, the brakes, and the chain of the bike. The air is inside of the tires and tubes. The brakes, the B's, the brakes are actually on the wheel itself, and these are brake levers. These are the activation for the brakes, and the C being the chain. We'll also cover the Q, the quick check, which are these quick release levers that are attached, see if I can point to it, attach the wheel to the frame and attach my seat and make sure that my seat is the right size, right height and right angle. And we call this the ABCQ check. Now, the importance of the ABCQ check is to make sure that the air, the brakes, the chain, and the quick releases are all functional and in good condition before you hop on your bike and ride. So if you don't have air in your tires, if your brakes are unhooked or too weak or in bad condition, or if your chain has dropped, or if your quick release levers are open, it's actually dangerous to ride your bike. And it's very easy to actually manipulate all of these. I'll show you how, but it's also easy to mess these up. So you might not realize, for instance, that you have a slow leak in your tires. So you go, you drive to the store, you lock up at the bike rack, you go in, you eat some lunch, and you come out and you got a flat tire. It happens. It happened to me. It's probably going to happen to you if you ride regularly. Don't worry, but you'll need to know to check the tires pretty much every single time before you ride. Even if you put a little air in that morning, as you go out for a ride and do a stop, give a good squeeze of the tires just to check to make sure that you don't have a slow leak. It's just about being aware and part of the basic regular checkup of the bike. Let's see where else to go with the ABCs. And there is more extensive stuff that can be done. We're not going to cover today changing a tube and a tire. That in itself is probably its own hour-long webinar. But I'm happy to maybe schedule one in the future or answer some further questions there. And the reason I'm not going to do changing a tube and a tire is because it's a little bit different depending on the wheel. So I'm going to try to make things as basic as possible here. All right. So first thing I'll do whenever I'm doing my ABC check is actually just run through the A, the B, and the C, and the Q for the quick. Let me demonstrate. So for the A, all you have to do is really squeeze the tires. And you're going to want to know how much air is in the tires to make it feel from a squeeze test at a maximum and a minimum that is recommended on the side of the tire. I'll talk about that in a second. But just go by feel to give a good squeeze of the tire. If it's squishy and you can really give some good squeeze, maybe get your thumb in there about an inch or inch and a half, you need to put air in your tires. You're riding on too little air, and that could cause a flat tire from a pinch flat. Talk about that in a second. Or it could be dangerous because you don't have good traction and you don't have good stability. You need to make sure your tires are inflated to the recommended pressure. Best way to do that without touching a pump and a gauge is just give it a good squeeze. That's the A. The B, you want to squeeze the brake levers and make sure that when they lock out, rock your bike and the wheels don't rotate. If the wheels are not rotating and I'm putting some good force in there, that means that these brakes are in okay condition. I also want to pay attention to, let's see if you can watch this brake lever right here. As I squeeze the brake lever and it locks out, I got some space in between the handlebar and the brake lever, which means my cable is a good tension. So again, squeeze the brake cables, the brake levers, rock the bike, make sure nothing is rotating, and make sure that the brake lever has a little bit of space between the end of the handlebar when it locks out. That's the B. And the C is really just pay attention to your chain, maybe pedal backwards and make sure the chain rotates without clicking, which means it's not in a bad gear, or even lift up the rear wheel and give it a good spin forwards and make sure that the wheel rotates, that the chain doesn't skip between gears. The chain is attached, which I'll talk a little bit about later about the chain falling off, and that the wheel can actually spin without rubbing on the frame or rubbing on the brakes. It's actually pretty easy for the wheel to come a little bit skewed. And if it's skewed, there's not a lot of space between the brake pad and the rim. If the wheel is at an angle, you could be rubbing on the brakes, and you don't want to be rubbing on your brake when you're riding. So I'll pick up the rear wheel again, give it a good pedal, and make sure everything's in good condition. And then I'll do the same for the front. I'll lift the front wheel up, give it a good spin, make sure nothing is rubbing. And then the Q is just make sure the quick releases are solid and they're locked up. I'll talk about them in a minute when we go into a little bit more depth. The quick releases are actually these little levers that are a little hard to see here, but they have an open position and a closed position. When I open it up, my wheel is actually loose. I don't know if you can hear it rattling around. But when I close down my quick release lever, which requires a little bit of force, see, my wheel is no longer rocking back and forth. And I can very easily open my quick release lever, and now my wheel is loose, which is dangerous. But if I lock it down, now my wheel is solid. And then I have one more quick release, which is at, see if I can remove these lights. Sorry for that. Always good to have lights on. I have a quick release lever on my seat. And if this is open, then my seat becomes loose, which actually is very dangerous because then I don't have stability when I'm sitting on my bike. So I want to make sure my quick releases are closed. So that's the ABC check: air, brakes, chain, and quick. Very simple. One more time. Squeeze the tires, squeeze the brakes, give the chain a good spin, give the front wheel a good spin, and then I'll just do a quick check to my quick releases to make sure that everything is in good working order. And that's it. Boom. 7 seconds, maybe 9 seconds worth of time. I've made sure I've aired my tires. I've made sure my brakes will stop. I've made sure my chain is in okay condition. And my wheels and my seat are secured onto my frame. A, B, C, quick check. Anybody can do it. Everybody should do it. Young, old, regardless of the bike. Now, your bike might not have quick release levers, so you might need to skip that step. That's okay. Sometimes there's just a bolt that holds things onto the frame. Not a big deal. Sometimes you'll have different types of brakes. And some, very few, but some tires are either what's called solid tires. They're solid composite, so you don't even have any air to fill up. Or they're tubeless tires, which is a whole other thing that we won't really talk about much either, but they can run on much lower pounds per square inch pressure. All right. Any questions so far? I'll take a quick pause. No? Shaking heads? Great. All right. So we're going to go a little bit in depth of all three, the A, B, C, and actually the Q. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit about manipulating and taking care of your bike yourself. All right. Pardon me while I pause real quick, take a sip of water. And I will say, it is a gorgeous day outside for most of you. But I'm working in my basement to demonstrate, because that's where I assume most of you will be working. You could pull your bike outside. You could put your bike on your, if you have a car with a rack, you could put your bike on the car rack and actually work on your bike from there. But assuming that most of us are homebound for now, assuming that most of us don't have a lot of technology for bike stands, I'm going to do whatever I can in my basement so that you'll see it's possible for you to do it just the same. All right. So what is with the A? So A is air, and the air is actually in an inner tube, which is inside of this tire. This is probably repetition for most of you, but you'll need to know how much air goes into your tire. And the best way to do that is to actually locate on the side of the tire how much pressure your tire requires. Now, it'll be probably in the unit PSI. Let's see, does anybody know what PSI stands for? This will be something that I also ask if we were in person.
Pounds per square inch.
Yes, great. Pounds per square inch. Excellent, thank you. It is a measurement, it is a unit of measurement in terms of pressure of what's going on in the inner tube. Inside of this tire is the inner tube. The tire creates the structure as the inner tube fills up, and the tire holds it in place. The more air you fill, the more pressure it gets, and it's under PSI. Other units that are used are BAR. We don't really use bars. That's a barometric pressure one. We use PSI in this country mostly because it's a standard that we use. Now, you're going to have the very few tools that are required for today's lesson. One of them is a floor pump, preferably with a good gauge on it. I don't know if I can get this in there. It's a little hard to see, but this is my gauge right here. And this tells me how much PSI will be in my hose when I connect it up to my inner tube. I recommend getting a good floor pump. If you don't have one at home and you have a bike, you should probably go get a good floor pump. I would recommend most bike shops, you know, of course they can let you use their pumps whenever you show up, but we're not really visiting shops and using public pumps these days. So I'd recommend getting your own floor pump at home and getting a good one. Oh, I left my travel pump in the other room, but I can give it, I'll show you when I take a break. I'll grab an example of a smaller pump. But the beauty of a floor pump like this is that this air chamber right here, when I pump up, this whole air chamber fills with air, and it's very easy for me to fill my tires. Highly recommend getting a good floor pump, one with a gauge that you trust. So once you've got your floor pump with a gauge, you're going to have to locate on the side of the tire how much PSI this tire is rated for. Every tire is different. There's a relative range based on the width of the tire, which will pertain to how much pressure the tire can handle. But the best way to know what your pressure is actually to find it embossed on the side of your tire, which is a little frustrating sometimes because it can wear away, it can rub off, and it's hard to find. But if you dig deep and look, you'll see, and I wonder if I can bring my screen close enough for you all to see. Let's see if you can see right there. It says 35 to 80 PSI. Is that visible for folks? Because it's barely visible for me. And it's sometimes a struggle to find. But this front tire is 35 to 80 pounds per square inch. Now, what does that mean? That means when I put my pump head on my tube and I equalize the pressure from my hose into my inner tube, the recommended pressure needs to be at least 35 PSI. The minimum 35 PSI. I can go the maximum of 80. Now that's a pretty big range, 35 PSI to 80. Just for comparison, for those of you who maybe have a road bike with thinner tires, your PSI is probably rated to around 90 or 100 PSI, or even higher, could be 110 PSI, which is way more pressure than this tire can handle. If I put 100 PSI in this tire, it would blow off the rim and the tube would explode. Also for comparison, for those of you who have cars and fill up your car tire, does anybody know how much PSI your cars generally take? 28, 30 PSI, low pressure comparatively. But there's a lot of air that goes into car tires. And the reason is basic physics. Car tires are wide, which means there's a lot of volume to fill, which means you don't need as much pressure to get the stability, whereas bike tires are thin, especially road bike tires can be super thin as 23 millimeters wide, which is not very much. And that's why the pressure system is so much higher in a road bike because of thinner wheels. Now these tires are pretty fat and they're designed for off-road. That's why they're knobby. And that's why they can take a low pressure system, because they're wide tires that have knobbies. If I was riding at 35 PSI, what would happen was this tire would squish a little bit, just a little bit under pressure. it would splay out, and the rubber from my tires would have some good contact surface to dig into the dirt, dig into the grass, and have a lot of contact. And that's at 35 PSI. It adds a little bit more squish and splay. At 80 PSI, this feels rock hard. I couldn't even give a little tiny squeeze. I would want to ride 80 PSI if I was ever riding on the road, if I was ever worried about riding on pavement, because you don't need a lot of surface contact to get good traction between the rubber of the tire and the tarmac of the road. You just need a little patch of rubber, which is why road bikes, even though their wheels are super, super thin, have no problem staying upright even when you're banking. However, this tire is a little bit versatile, which is why it's got a range. The lower range at 35 means that it's squishier. It's a softer ride. It's meant for digging into dirt, but it's less efficient because there's more friction being lost of contact from the tire onto the tarmac. Whereas if I were riding at the higher range, there would be less opportunity for the tire to squish, less contact of the rubber on the road, which means it's a more efficient ride. But the flip side is that I would feel every bump. The softer the tire, the more suspension that comes from air inside in the pneumatic tube. The harder the pressure, the more you're going to feel every jarring bump. Now, it's up to me what I prefer as long as I'm within my range that's recommended on my tire. I just need to be above 35 or below 80 and I'll be okay. You should check your tires to find out what your rating is. And I guarantee you it'll be embossed on the side of the tire. However, I do have a little chart here that runs through some typical recommended pressures. Road bikes are typically 90 to 110 PSI, and road bikes are the thinner tires with the drop handlebars, much lighter weight. Hybrid bikes are generally upright bikes that are very efficient with gears, and they're generally 65 to 90 PSI. Off-road trail bikes, which is more like an adventure bike, not necessarily this one, would be about 50 to 75 PSI. Kids bikes and cruiser bikes can range between 30 and 60, and a mountain bike like mine one here, generally around 30 to 40 if I was doing it off-road. But the beauty of these tires that I have here is that they have a range. They can do the higher pressure. And it's not about the tube, it's all about the tire and the structure of the tire as it can hold on to the rim. Cool. I'll take a quick pause. I'll see there's a couple of questions I'll go for here. Can you use an electric pump? For pumping up a tire, yes, an electric pump works just fine. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but the concern is that some electric pumps, especially at gas stations, pump out air so quickly that you can blow the tire off. So you want to actually be a little careful there. And you'll need to modify the pump head to make sure it fits onto the tube. And I'll talk about that in a second as well. And then I ride a hybrid on paved and unpaved. Should I feel somewhere in the mid-range? Good question. I would recommend trying both and finding what your preference is. And the beauty of knowing what it feels like to ride at your minimum and giving your tire a squeeze, and then riding at your maximum and giving your tire a squeeze, is that when you do the squeeze test, you can know where within your range you're going to be riding at. If you're riding on gravel, I'd recommend relatively towards the lower end of the range. But if you're riding on pavement, and you want to ride efficiently, which means, pretty quickly, you want to be towards the higher end. So it really is a personal preference. All right, that said, let's check these tires. So I know that this tire is a range between 35 and 80. I'm going to be riding on pavements. I'm going to want to put it towards the higher end of the range, but I don't want to be riding and feel every bump. So I'm going to put it around 60. I'm going to make sure that that is at 60. Now, the way that I pump up the tire, and again, this may be remedial for a lot of you, the first thing I want to do is locate the valve, which for some reason always ends up by the brakes, and you always have to turn the wheel to make sure the valve is reachable. So I'll put my valve, you can kind of see it right here, relatively like down towards the bottom of the wheel, just so gravity is my helper. I'm going to want to make sure I know what style of valve I'm using. Now, there are two types of valve systems that are common in the States. There's the Schrader valve, which is the same as a car tire, and it's got a internal little plunger that you can see right there that needs to be depressed in order to access the air. And there's a gasket inside of here that the inner plunger, you actually have to depress in order to let air in and out. This is a Schrader valve. Very common on mountain bikes, on hybrid bikes, and it's also the same exact valve system as your car. And the second type of valve system is called a Presta. A Presta valve, it's a little hard to see on the zoom, but the Presta right here is much, much thinner than the Schrader. And it actually operates a little bit differently because it is a thinner valve system. It does not have the internal spring structure that a Schrader has. So you actually have a brass tip at the top. Let me see if I can make this here. And you have to unscrew, and that's how you access the valve. Now, when it's unscrewed, I can put air in and let air out. And then when I'm done, I want to screw that back down. And now my valve is closed. So you're going to want to know what type of valve system your bike has. The reason there are two are a couple of reasons, actually. The first is that the Schrader valve is a fatter valve. So you need to bore a wider hole in the rim of the wheel in order to fit a Schrader valve. This means that this is only really made for wider wheels. And if you have a thin road bike wheel, this would be a compromised hole to be putting into your rim. So you have the Presta. This is made for more road bike, more thinner wheels. The valve system itself is a little bit different. The rubber spring-loaded gasket in the Schrader valve is, let's call it a less efficient valve. It does not handle higher pressures well. It leaks more at a higher pressure rate. So they've created the Presta, which has a screw tip mechanism to secure it with the gasket inside. So this can handle higher pressure. Higher pressure also is for road bikes as well. So typically the be all end all is if you've got a road bike, you've got a Presta valve, mostly. If you have a hybrid or a mountain bike, chances are you have a Schrader valve. They're not really interchangeable. And the reason is because if you have a wheel made for a Presta valve, the hole for the valve will be too small and you can't fit the Schrader in it. You're going to have to stick with Presta tubes. And you're going to want to know, well, one, you can just obviously look at your bike, but you're going to want to know whenever you go and replace your tube, what valve system you're going to get. And this is super important, is that it will be written on the box of tubes. You can see right here, this is a Schrader valve. A lot of folks don't know that, so basic stuff, but it's some stuff that bike shops either forget to tell you or assume that you already know. And you'll be amazed at folks who don't really know the difference between the Schrader and the Presta. Once you've got that down, that never changes. Your bike will handle whatever valve system you're working on. You just need to make sure that you replace it with like kind. So again, Presta and Schrader. So this one down here is a Schrader valve, which is also important to know because my pump head actually fits both. And I'm going to need to know which head I'm going to be working with. You'll see that the bottom hole on this pump head is smaller. This is made for the Presta. The top hole there is actually made for Schrader. Your pump is different than my pump. Your pump might not look like this. Your pump might only have one hole that's made for both. We call that a universal. Or it might be one with a hole on either side of the pump head, which is also kind of frustrating to use because you inherently leak air whenever you're trying to put it on and off. Or maybe your pump's only made for one variety. So know how your pump works. Your pump will be different than mine, but it will be finicky for whatever reason. Pumps just always are finicky. But you're going to need to know which one to go with. So because I know I have a Schrader, I know I'm going to go for the top, and I'll get to it. So it's a little hard sometimes. Maybe I can actually rotate this up. Maybe I'll do it this way, actually. I'll demonstrate closer in, and then I'll do it on my real bike. Every pump is challenging and every pump is finicky, but the best way to put a pump head on is very firmly and straight and direct when you put it on. And then most pumps lock into place by pulling the lever upwards. And now I've actually created a seal between my pump head and my valve. And when I pump it up, I'll do a couple of pumps and make sure that air is actually going into the tube, which it is right now. Now, sometimes you misalign the pump head and you'll put it on at an angle, and you can't really, like, I'm struggling to push this down because the air is not flowing from the pump head into the valve very easily. That's common. Don't worry if it takes you a few times to put this pump head onto the valve. It may take 3, 4, 5, or 6 times before you get a good seal. Sometimes you might even need to let a little air out of the tube if you've got a little air in there already, just to kind of break the seal and make sure that the air can flow in and air can flow out. So it's something to keep in mind. Don't get too frustrated with your pump. And I know this from experience that it can be very frustrating when you misalign the pump and you put it on kind of an angle, a little hard to see there, and you think that you've got a seal, but you do 1 or 2 pumps down, and then all of a sudden you're at 100 PSI on your gauge, and you say, oh, well, that's not right. Very simple, just take the pump head off, try to put it back on again, and just have a little bit of patience. So I'm gonna do here, find my valve, put it in, and we'll open it up, and I'm at about 25. Once I've put the pump head on, and I've got essentially the same pressurized tube, which in just like my inner tube here, I'm gonna give about 1 good solid pump, and that will equalize the pressure from the hose into my inner tube. So what happens is the inner tube matches the pressure that's inside of the hose, and that's how the gauge can read it. Let's see if I can pull this a little closer, and you can see my gauge here. So it's set, right now it's at about 30. So with 1 pump, I went from about 25 to 30. But again, my minimum is 35, so I at least need 1 or 2 more pumps in here to make sure I'm at my very basic. And because I'm going to be riding on the road, I want to be at a little bit higher pressure. I'm going to probably put it at around 60. But this is the idea. I know this is very basic for a lot of you, but it's good to get a sense of just going through the motions and pumping up your tubes. A couple things about a pump. You want to make sure that the chamber fills completely, so you pull all the way up and you push all the way down. If you're only going like this, you're really not using the pump efficiently, and you're not going to be able to inflate your tire like you need to. Up and down, all the way up, all the way down, all the way up and all the way down. And if you're new to pumping up your tires, give it a good squeeze throughout the process, so you know how much squish you have at the lower range, you know how much squish you have at the medium range, and you know how much squish you'll have at the upper range. In the interest of time, I'm only at about 50, but I'm going to stop at 50, knowing that's in my middle range, and I'm going to feel comfortable riding on it. The trick here for pulling the pump head off, you have to be very gentle. When you open up the seal, to make sure that you pull the pump head off directly out, not at an angle. It's actually very easy to tear your valve if you're yanking your pump head off your valve, and then you've damaged your tube, and then you'll need to replace your tube. So be extra, extra careful when you're pumping, just when you're pulling your pump head on and off. All right, so I know this is kind of remedial, but very important to understand that you should know from the squeeze test, the minimum, the medium, and the maximum of how you go, so that you can just check it mid-ride. You do not really want any squish. Even though I'm at 50, which is between 35 and 80, it feels pretty hard. Feels almost rock hard. If you get a little bit of squish, especially if you're on a hybrid bike or a road bike, even a little bit of squish could serve you poorly. What happens is the inner tube inside of the tire, if there's a little bit of give, will pinch against the rim, the metal rim, and you'll get what's called a pinch flat. What happens is there's kind of I wouldn't call it too sharp, but there's a very severe edge to the rim that the tire locks into. If the tube is too squishy, it can actually squeeze between the tire and the rim and cause 2 little puncture holes in your tube. We call those snakebite flat or a pinch flat. And you know, when I was working at the bike shop, it was about like 90% of the flats that we would see in the shop were because people did not inflate their tire properly or inflate it enough. There's too much squish in the tire. The tube squished between the tire and the rim and got a pinch flat. So when you're riding on soft tires, you're more likely to get a flat tire. And that'll happen when you hit a bump, a pothole, a curb or something, and like a little bit of compression in there pinches the tube, which is a little counterintuitive in the way most people feel, because what they're gonna be worried about mostly is too much pressure blows the tire off. It's a common misconception. These tires, most tires, bike tires, are really strong and really sturdy. They're made for a certain maximum pressure. So don't feel hesitant about pumping them up as long as you are up to the maximum. Cool. If you're following along at home, let me know if you can find where on the side of the tire it has your PSI, your pounds per square inch. And for those of you on the chat, let me know if you like to prefer to ride at the minimum or the maximum or somewhere in the middle of your ride. Cool. And one more thing about tires and tubes is that, you know, over time, even if you don't ride your bike a lot, your tires will start to deteriorate, and your tube a little bit less so, but will also start to deteriorate as well. You will notice what we call sidewall dry rot, even without a lot of use, where the rubber just starts to delaminate, and you'll see threading of the tire. And if that's the case, you'll need to get new tires. If you see any bulging, when you're pumping up your tire especially, but if you notice there's any bulging out where the inner tube is pushing through the side of the tire, you need to get new tires. Don't be surprised if it's been a couple years and you are giving a good look over and you're identifying some spots on your tire and you see maybe there's pieces of glass in there, maybe there's a little piece of rock in there. If debris gets stuck in the rubber, they can kind of wiggle its way through as many thousands, hundreds of thousands of rotations and actually get through to the inner tube and give yourself a flat. And if you're one who has had several flats recently, chances are your tires are compromised and you need to go ahead and get new tires. It's not that big of a deal. They're pretty cheap. A bike shop will help you out. And again, it's probably a whole other hour-long lesson to teach you how to change your tires. But one thing you do need to keep in mind is the size and the dimensions of the tire. There'll be two numbers that are on the edge of the tire. They'll have the width of the tire and the diameter of the wheel. So these right here is a 26 by 1.95. 26 refers to the diameter of the wheel, and the 1.95 refers to the width of the tire itself. I'm going to need to know my wheel size, and I'm going to need to know how wide or skinny a tire it can take. If I put a wrong dimension, it wouldn't fit, wouldn't necessarily work. Also, same to think about with this tube right here. This is a 16 by 1 3/8 inch. 16 refers to the diameter, 1 3/8 inch refers to the width. You're going to need to know. So this 16-inch wheel inner tube would not fit my 26-inch wheel mountain bike. So some things to keep in mind are the dimensions of the diameter and the width of the tire, which fit specifically to the wheel, and then which type of valve system you have, whether it's a Schrader and a Presta. And with those two numbers, you're pretty much good to go. They don't change. So once you know what they are in your bike, you're good. But if you ever do something like change your tires, and you'll see that my mountain bike actually has two different tires, which means that it has two different ratings. And I know that my rear tire only goes up to 60 PSI. So if I'm trying to pump my front tire to 80, I should not pump my rear tire to 80 because I'm going to blow it. Everything is a little bit nuanced. So pay attention. And again, my bike is different than your bike, but chances are 99% of you have a similar inner tube system, which is either Presta or Schrader, and a similar wheel size, which is probably either a 27 or 700-inch wheel, which is the diameter, or a 26-inch wheel like my mountain bike here. Cool. So that's a really long-winded way to show you how I pump up my tires. Now, the be-all end-all is just a squeeze test. Once you get good at the squeeze test, you're good to go, but you should know what goes into the squeeze test to know where you're at. I'll take a quick pause before going into B. Is there anything else?
Yeah, can you put a Presto in a Schrader rim to get the higher efficiency of a Presto?
Good question. I wouldn't recommend it. And the reason is because it's the Presta here is a thinner diameter. It's a little hard to see, but the hole that fits the Schrader is going to be wider than the Presta valve itself. So a little bit of inner tube might stick through. So one thing you can't do is if you only have the size for a Presta, this won't fit at all. The Schrader won't fit at all. You might be able to put a Presta into a Schrader-sized wheel because it's a thinner valve going into a wider hole, but you run the risk of the inner tube actually poking through along with it, and then you'll get a flat tire. So in a pinch, you can, if you only have a thinner valve and you want to put it in the fatter hole, but it's not recommended, and you really need to kind of keep your valves matching with the holes that's in the wheels.
Is it normal for a pump gauge to shoot to a higher value when pumping on it and then settle down to a lower value?
Oh, yes. Thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to mention that. It's where the needle settles. So when you pump it up, there'll be a lot of pressure at the start of the pump, and then you might need to give it a second to where the needle will settle. It's not the maximum the needle goes to, it's where the needle is resting at.
You might be on your way to answering this question, but do you own or recommend a bike repair stand, and how much would you pay for one if you do?
Oh, good question. Park Tools is probably one of the most prolific ones out there. It's the blue Park Tools. They're made out of Minnesota. I like Pedros as well. Pedros is a quasi-local company. They do a lot of chain lubricants and chain and bike solvents as well for cleaning. Pedros does tools and stands, and they were a local. I think they were up in Haverhill for a bit. So, you know, Pedros is good. You don't need a bike stand, I would say, if you don't want to. I was actually saw a bike. I was at my friend's house yesterday, and he was using a cheap metal coat rack from Target as a bike stand, where he was just resting the nose of the saddle on a coat rack. That works just fine. You could fit 2 bikes on it, and it was stable enough. And then for those of you who have trunk racks for a car, those actually work really well for bike repair because you can put the bike in on the trunk rack, which is pretty much at standing height, and you can run through the gears and spin the pedals and run the wheels no problem as well. So for portable stands though, for your own basement or garage, I mean, I would expect if you wanted to buy a Pedros or a Park Tool, they're around 150 bucks, which is not the end of the world. But if you get good at doing basic repairs, you're going to maintain your bike, which means it's not going to break, which means you're going to save money on replacement parts and labor, and you're going to have a better functioning bike. So you're going to enjoy the ride much, much more.
Can you recommend PSI for a tubeless on a road bike?
Ooh, good question. They can go pretty low, but they can also go to their maximum as well. Every tire is different, so I would really ask you to consult your local bike shop to double check it. But I know that on mountain bikes, you know, you can go as low as 15 PSI on some tubeless tires, which is why a lot of cyclocross and mountain bike racers will ride it, because they can go low PSI, which get a lot of traction in dirt and mud. On road, you know, really, you can probably go up to 110 PSI. It really depends on your own tire and your personal preference. But tubeless does afford you more flexibility of the range. You can go mainly on the lower end. You can go lower without running the risk of a pinch flat.
Okay. On a hot day, can the tire pressure increase significantly as you ride?
That's a really good question. I think the jury's out on that. And I've heard both sides. I've also heard that, like, if you leave it in your car on a hot day and your car gets to like 140 degrees, your tires might blow. I have heard of that happening, but I don't know if like riding on a, I don't think there's like friction happening from the molecules of air bouncing around or anything like that. However, I have heard both ways, so I'm not a good judge.
So related to that, do you recommend a slightly higher pressure in winter versus summer?
You know, it's funny. I actually recommend a lower pressure in winter as long as it's still within the range. And the reason for that is because you can roll over rock salt and some of the debris that the DPW will throw out to melt the snow. Rock salt can be like, you know, that big. And if you've got 110 PSI, you're going to feel every bump. So that's one thing. And you get a little bit more traction, especially if there's a little bit of winter weather out there. Again, you don't need a lot of traction to get rubber of the tire on the pavement, but if there's slush or any wetness, then a little bit more squish is better because you get a little bit more dig. And we're talking like very, very minute, like 0.5 millimeter difference between one PSI to a different PSI, but it does make a difference. So I actually recommend in the winter just a little bit under, and not related to temperature at all. It's just for those other two reasons.
Okay, we have a few more. I noticed that my tires need to be pumped up every couple of weeks. Should I be concerned that they don't hold pressure longer?
Oh, good question. Yeah, you might have a slow leak, and valves are imperfect. Don't get me wrong. These are not this is not a perfect system right here. This will leak eventually. I ride every day generally, not very much, like 5 miles a day, especially when I'm commuting, maybe 10 miles a day. I pump up my tires every week. I put at least 10 PSI in my tires every week. So that's okay. You'll notice that if you go on a long ride, say you do a 30, 40, 50 mile ride, which some people do, you'll pump it up and you'll lose 10 PSI on the ride because air just leaks out. So don't be surprised. If it's just every couple of weeks, that's totally fine. Or even if it's just 10 PSI once a week, that's normal.
What do you think of glueless tube patches versus glued?
Oh yeah, I'm not gonna talk about patches too much on this one because it's a little more complicated. I recommend though the glued patch. So there's a couple ways that you can fix a flat tire. Say you locate 2 holes here, you got a pinch flat, you want to fix it because you only have 1 tube and you got patches. The Band-Aid style that are sticky, you can just put them over the holes and hopefully they do the job of making sure that the hole is plugged. Or you get the fluid, the vulcanizing fluid, which is essentially like a glue. But the vulcanizing fluid is actually much stronger. And what that does is it's not really a glue. It's not something that like is a paste that is a stickiness. What it does is it actually takes bits of rubber from your tire and remelts it. And then the rubber from your patch actually chemically bonds with the rest of the tube. So what you're doing with a vulcanized, glued, quote, patch kit is you start with a little bit of sandpaper, you rough up the tube around the hole, you apply the vulcanizing fluid, which is glue, some people think, you let it dry, you let it sit for 5 minutes, so you don't even use it wet, and then you put the patch on it. And what happens is, again, it's a seal, it's a whole chemical bond seal that actually adds rubber to rubber, and you're actually basically building more tube. It's not like a Band-Aid that covers it. It's more of a fused chemical bond. And if you do that properly, that'll last forever. Whereas the patches that just stick on that are like Band-Aids, those don't really last forever. So I do recommend getting good at the glued ones. I'm going to be fully transparent though and say that I don't really patch very much because I'm not good at it. There's a couple of reasons I'm not good at it. Is one, I usually don't let the vulcanizing fluid dry enough before I put my patch on it. So it doesn't actually do the chemical bond that I'm looking for it to do. And 2, it's just, you know, I'm more impatient, I think. And I usually, if I'm going to go off on a ride, I'll bring a spare tube or even 2 spare tubes to do it because I trust new tubes much more than I trust my own patch ability.
And did you talk about the life expectancy, the expected life expectancy of a tube?
Oh, good question. A lot of that depends mainly on moisture, I would say. So tubes will rot out over time. It's just natural. If it's been years, that's fine. You might need to get new tubes. But I've also seen tubes that have lasted forever. Well, not forever, I should say like a decade or 2. I've found bikes that have been from the 70s that are still holding air. So it really, I don't know if there's a be all end all as to one way or another, but I do know the one thing that kills rubber more than anything else is moisture. So if you have a dank basement that gets dry and hot, you'll probably have a little bit of just basically just it rots out, which is normal. Some people take a little bit of baby powder or talcum powder and they'll coat their tubes with it, and then they'll put their tube in with their tire, so there's a layer that kind of absorbs moisture. And that also prevents the sticking of the tube onto the tire, which can be a problem. So the biggest thing you really have to worry about is just wetness. But again, you know, bikes are made for outdoors and tubes are cheap. So don't let this be a concern. Like if you have to replace your tubes, it's probably less than $10 to do it. You probably don't have to do it that often. And then a lot of it is just on how much you ride. So if you ride more, it's just going to do more wear and tear. Tires will wear out differently depending on the terrain that you ride on. If you're a fair weather rider, you're obviously going to wear down your componentry less. If you ride through the rain, rain is actually, especially the first maybe half an hour after a rainstorm, a lot of the debris from the street gets kind of unstuck and is floating around is more likely to stick to your rubber. So, you know, there's different ways of taking care of your bike. I'm a believer, and maybe this is not the best thing to share, but I'm a believer in kind of like riding my bike really hard until I end up destroying a lot of it and having to do some replacement, because I feel that, you know, bikes should be ridden. But that's just my own personal philosophy. Some people are very meticulous about making sure that every little tooth of their cog is clean. I'm one who's just like, I'm going to ride it. I'll replace it when I need to replace it.
I guess I'm going to let you continue. It's just about 1 o'clock now, and I'll hold on to the other couple of questions for the next time you break.
Great. Okay, I'll fly through the other two. So A for air, B for brakes. So the most important part about riding a bike is being able to stop. You have to be able to stop. You have to be able to do a controlled stop. You have to be able to do an emergency stop. You've got to stop your bike. My bike here, again, like I was saying earlier, has two brake levers in the front, horizontal brakes. These are mountain brake styles. Yours might be different. They might loop down, but chances are you've got a cable pull system. And by that, I mean that there's a cable system that hooks onto the brakes, and you'll see it kind of flows behind through what's called housing. And the housing comes up into my handlebars, into my brake levers. And then when I pull my brake lever, I activate the cable and I pull it. And it's just that, you know, 2 inches of cable pull is all of my stopping power. Now, because it's not a lot of pull, you have to be pretty aware on how it's functioning so that you can modify it. Again, the be all end all is squeezing the brakes and rocking the bike. And if the wheels don't turn, you're doing all right. There might be the case where your brakes are open. You might have a quick release on your brakes, like mine are right here. And if I pop this cable open, now my brakes are open and I can't stop. I'm going to want to know if that's happening before I'm on my bike. So one thing to know is, are your brakes hooked up? You probably have a quick release lever somewhere along your brake. Maybe it's a lever that you can turn. A few of you might not, but if you're unfamiliar about where your quick release is, your bike shop will help you out. Or you can also get in touch with me, and chances are if you just send a photo, I can take a look at your bike. Or you can Google it, of course. But, you know, brakes need to be hooked up for one. Second thing is you need to have good rubber. So the beauty of being able to unhook my brakes here is that I can actually get good access to my brake pads. And that means if there's any debris stuck in my brake pads, if there's any bits of metal, if there's a staple or something, because, you know, it's natural. You're riding through a lot of debris, and every time you brake, you're kind of crushing whatever you're riding in into your pad. You can actually clean off your pads. So being able to access your pads is important. And then also being able to unhook my brake like this means that I can pull my wheel off my bike without needing to kind of pull the tube or the tire through where my brakes are. So this allows me to remove my wheel. But if I ever unhook my brake or loosen my brake with a quick release, I'm going to need to know how to put it back on, hook it in, and then test it to make sure that it works, because you need to have brakes. So on brakes, what we're going to cover are, how is the condition of the pad? Are my cables looking okay? How is my brake lever locking out? And then knowing the difference between the front brake and the back brake. Maybe I'll start with the back and work my way forwards. I have 2 brakes on here. I have one for my front wheel and I have one for my back wheel. Chances are you've got the same. Now, the reason that you have a right hand back wheel is so that when my hand is off and I'm signaling, I can still have my right hand on and I can still activate my rear brake. Now, if I'm signaling with my right hand and my left hand is my only brake that I'm functioning with, and I do an emergency stop because somebody maybe pulled out with their car and I need to stop really quick. Do you know what happens if you hit the front brake too hard? Your weight can shift forwards, can go over the front wheel, and your bike could tip forwards. So be wary of that. Now, the other side is if you only hit the back brake and I slam on the back brake, see if I can do camera angle. You'll see I'll hit the back brake and my back wheel is not rotating, but my bike is still moving forwards. So I always like to ask this, and when I'm teaching my 3rd graders, I'm like, which brake is the stronger brake, the front brake or the back brake? most kids think it's the back brake because that's what they slam, right? The stronger of the two brakes is the front brake. And the reason for that is that's just basic physics. If you stop something at the front of its movement, it actually stops. If you stop something in the back of its movement, the momentum can still carry it forwards. And even though that wheel is not turning, my bike is skidding forwards. So you should know that there's two different strengths to the brakes, and the stronger of the two is the front. Now, I'm not saying avoid your front. I'm not saying you're gonna flip over forwards. You still need to know how to stop strongly. So know how both your front brake and your back brake work together. But know that the front brake really is the real stopping power when it comes down to it. So that said, let's take a look at the brake itself. So I've got my brakes here, which are probably different than your brakes, but I've got my rubber. I'm going to make sure that my rubber is in good condition. As you wear down your brake, what's going to happen is the rubber is going to fade away and just get worn down through friction, and you're going to get down to the metal. If you're ever at the metal and every time you brake, you hear this scraping sound on your rim, get new brake pads. Do not ride your bike. If you are ever scraping metal to the rim, what you're doing is carving away your rim. And trust me, I've actually been there. You can actually go through the rim and the rim can basically fall apart. Then you've broken your bike and you might be crashing. So make sure that you've got good rubber on the brake pad. Next, you want to make sure the brake pad actually hits the rim and not the tire or not the bottom half of the rim. There's not a lot of space here. This is only about maybe 1 inch to 1.5 inches wide. If I'm not getting good contact between my brake pad and my rim, then I'm not getting enough stopping power. And again, it all comes down to being able to stop quickly. So once you've diagnosed your pad and you know that it's in good condition and you know that it's hitting properly on the rim, you're in good shape. If you ever need to clean your pad or clean your rim, I recommend only using rubbing alcohol. Only rubbing alcohol for your brakes and wheels. Don't use a degreaser, don't use a solvent, just use rubbing alcohol. And the reason is rubbing alcohol evaporates and leaves no residue. You want to have no residue on your brake pads or your rims. So just use rubbing alcohol. All right, so my pads, good condition. They're looking pretty sharp, looking pretty full. I appreciate it. They're making good contact with the rim. I'm going to check both sides because there's 2 of them. That looks pretty good. The cable doesn't look too rusty. It has some good action from when I pull the cable and there's some response. And then, I'll check the back and just make sure it's all pretty good. And I'll do the same to the rear. Next, I'm going to diagnose whether or not my lever is tight enough, or my cable is tight enough, which means my lever is has a little bit of a gap between my handlebars and when I lock out. This is the tip that I want to teach you. This is what you're going to go home with. It's knowledge about the barrel adjuster. Assuming that you've got a cable pull system like I have here, happens is the cable comes from the brakes through the housing up to the lever, and there's somewhere along this line there will be a little knurled barrel, a little barrel that turns. And what this does is this adjusts the distance from which the cable has to travel. And I can actually make longer or make shorter how much the cable can flow. And I can do so with just a couple of screws from this barrel. So the way that it works here, and you can kind of see here, there's this silver part and this black part. Silver part's the barrel adjuster. The black part is the lock. I can move the lock out of the way, and I can actually screw in this barrel. I don't know if you can see it very well in the zoom, but I'm actually screwing it in. And what I've just done right here is I've loosened my cable. So I can pull my brake lever all the way to where it's touching the handlebar, yet my wheel can still spin. So what I've done is loosened my brakes to the point where they're ineffective. Now, why am I showing you that? Because I'm going to show you the opposite on how you tighten the brakes just the same with no tools needed. Again, what happens when you ride your bike and you brake a lot is the rubber will wear down on the pad, so there's more of a gap between the rim and the brake. So that over time, over use, your brakes just become a little bit looser and a little bit weaker. So you're going to need to tighten them. the easiest way to tighten them and the most basic way to tighten them at first is not to do anything down here. Find the barrel adjuster, unscrew the barrel adjuster. Let's see if I can get a good camera angle of me doing this. By unscrewing the barrel adjuster, it screws out a couple of threads. Can you kind of see it coming out a little bit? And then there's a lock that I'm going to lock into place. And now what I've done is I've tightened my cable so that when I lock out my handlebar, I can still get about 2 fingers of space between my handlebar and my brake lever. This is something that I want you to do. If you've got your bike, look somewhere along the cable system. Along that cable system, there will be a little knurled barrel, a little ridged barrel, and by unscrewing it, you're tightening your brakes. Now, you can tighten your brakes to whatever preference you have, but my rule is if you are, it's at least 2 fingers of space between the end of the handlebar and the lever when you lock it out. That allows you to do an emergency stop. And you can balance between the front brake and the back brake. You can kind of play around with your preference, but know that you can do this. And notice that it took no tools, right? This is a no tool necessary fix. I just tightened my brakes like that. You can even do this on a ride. You don't even have to stop pedaling. If your brake adjustment's right here, you can just do a quick little barrel adjuster and tighten yourself up. Now you don't want to tighten your brakes up to the point where it rubs when you ride. So whenever you've tightened your brakes, give it a good check to make sure that there's no rubbing of the pad. But know that you can tighten your own brake with the barrel adjuster. Now the barrel adjuster has a limit. You can only unscrew it so far. Once you've unscrewed it to the maximum and your brakes are still loose, time for new brake pads, time to go to a bike shop, get new pads, get a full brake adjustment. But in the meantime, just like you got to tighten, just like you have to pump your tire every so often, you're going to need to check your brakes and make sure that those are in good condition too. Cool. So again, the be all end all is when you pull the levers, do they lock out before they hit the handlebar? And then as they're locked out, do the wheels turn? And that's no, that's good. And then every so often give a good check to the rubber to make sure that you have rubber and that it's in good condition and that your rims and your brake pads are relatively clean, the best as possible. And again, know the difference between your front brake and your back brake. All right, that's the B. It's very simple. Any questions about the B?
Just one about the B. How do I know when to replace disc brake pads?
Ooh, disc brakes are harder because you can't actually see the contact between the rotor and the pad itself. Chances are it's probably the same way of doing it, where if you squeeze the lever to its fullest and it locks out and the wheel can still turn even a little bit, time to get new brake pads. Disc brakes are a little more finicky. If you get any grease or degreaser on the rotor and it transfers to the pad, your pads are shot and you have to get new brake pads. There's no helping it, which is why rubbing alcohol is super important to only use rubbing alcohol whenever you're cleaning your brakes. My rule for disc brakes really is it functional? If it's functional, great. If it's not working like you need to, it's time to adjust it. And different brake pads, there's a whole bunch I'm skipping over about how to adjust the angle in which the brake arms come in, and you can kind of tweak left arm versus right arm. Or on disc brakes, typically here's my rotor and here's my pad. You can change how the pad actually moves in. You can like tilt it up and tilt it down. There's a lot more nuances to it. But I think to answer your question, there is no real good way that I know of to take a look at your brake pads if it's a disc brake.
No other questions came in about B. Would you like to answer the other general questions from last time?
Sure,
Or
yeah.
save them to the end? Okay. Is tube versus tubeless more of a religious issue than a practical one?
I recommend, gosh, good question. Tubeless means that you are less likely to get flat tires, namely, but they're much harder to change out, and most people don't change out their own tubeless because it's so frustrating. So they just rely on the shop. So once you are good at changing your own tubes, I'd recommend sticking with that because that's something you'd be able to do on a ride in case you actually do get a flat tire. If you get good, if you can change your flat tire in, on the side of the road, then you're like pretty much at the pro level that I would consider that be all end all. So, it really depends on your own preference. If you feel like DIY, I recommend tubed. But if there's concerns about getting flats or you want to play around a little bit more with the minimum and maximum, then tubeless is another option. But I will say that not every wheel is built for tubeless. So you have to get a special wheel that's made for that type of tire. So you basically have to match the componentry if you're going to go that route.
Okay. And then a more general question. We are in the market for a new bike with social distancing. Would you recommend buying a bike online without riding it?
Ooh, no, not really. I'd recommend going to a bike shop for one, because there's accountability there. Most bike shops have a 30-day return. So if you don't like the bike for whatever reason, it's the wrong size or it's just not fun, you can always take it back. Chances are no problem. And, you know, online bikes, you don't know who built it. I think that's the biggest concern, is that you want to go to a reputable shop that's got an assembly department that actually builds bikes professionally. Walmart is not that. Target bikes are not built by anybody except probably the stock person, and they don't know bikes. I've seen a lot of Walmart bikes that are the fork, which is the front part, is on backwards, or brakes are misaligned, or the cable systems are just all messed up. There's a reason that bike mechanics are essential workers, because they're the ones building the bike and making sure that you're safe out there. Happy to go through some of the DIY stuff, and I do run a bike co-op, which is very much like doing it yourself, but it is under some guidance. Buying a bike online might be fine, but then you want to kind of bring it to a shop to then get a once over, because there could be a loose bolt or a loose screw or something that you would never really look for, but you really want a professional to take a look at it.
That's it for now.
Cool, great. All right, so we're going to go through the C. I'll try to leave you a little bit before 1:30 for some more Q&A, but the C, of course, is the chain. This is the go of the bike. Now, the chain is a super important part of the machine, because it takes all of the power from your foot, translates it to the crank, through the gear system, and then I'll change gears for you too. And you can see that as I change gears to the upper gear in the front, you'll see that it's not even even locked into place. There it is. Now it locks into place. Is that there's a lot of tension and pressure that is being placed on every little link. Now, I'm not going to go too much into shifting and derailleur adjustments. That, again, is its own hour-long course. But we are going to go into what you need to know, which is making sure your chain is clean and lubricated. So for this section, I'm actually going to put on some gloves, because that is handy. And I'll show you a couple of common problems that happen to a chain. The first is that the chain can drop off. I'll go to a different gear. The chain can drop off the gears, in which case I'm not going anywhere. I can't ride my bike. Now, some people, this happens because of shifting issues. If you shift too far one direction and pedal too hard while you're shifting gears, you can actually throw your chain on and off the gears. So just be very careful when you're shifting, and most of the time that won't happen. But occasionally, if you're, maneuvering your bike, pulling out of the garage, putting it in your car or whatever, the chain might drop and you can't ride your bike. It's actually very easy to fix though. Let me show you. If you've got a derailleur, and by that I mean the system in the back that changes gears, chances are you've got a little, what's called an arm or a lever that I can pull down, and you'll see, actually, now you'll see that I have a lot of slack in the chain. With that slack, I can literally just physically pick up my chain, put it on the gears. And the beauty of the chain is that it usually fixes itself just by pedaling forward. So even though you can kind of see my chain's only half on, it's really bent and tangled right now, by pedaling forwards, my chain resets itself. Most of the time, that's the case. If the chain is on the gears, all you got to do is pick up the rear tire, pedal forwards, and it will fix itself. But if it's backwards, or if the chain's twisted and you pedal backwards, you can drop the chain again. So you really got to be pedaling forward. One more time, a little bit of slack, picking up the chain, physically putting it on anywhere on the cogs, pedaling forwards, and my chain has reset itself. So if you're ever riding and your chain drops, hop off your bike, put it back on without your body weight or any more pressure than just physically putting the chain back on, picking up the rear wheel, and pedaling forwards with your hands. That's the first lesson. Super easy. Second lesson is actually cleaning the chain. And in order to do this, I'm going to turn my bike upside down. Now, I know a lot of bike mechanics watching are cringing right now. Don't really recommend putting your bike upside down too much because you mess with everything that's in the cockpit, and it could just be very careful with your gearing and your brake levers that are at your handlebars. So don't really recommend this too much, but I'm just going to do it now for demonstration purposes. But it is a lot easier to clean your chain when the bike's upside down because I'm going to need to be pedaling and moving my chain. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of force going through these chain links. I'm talking all of your weight, all of your wattage, all 700 watts of it. You're going up a hill. It's translated onto these tiny little pieces of metal that are doing hundreds of thousands of rotations. As a demonstration, this is my wooden chain link, which I made with a jigsaw and some wood glue, just to give you an idea of the makeup of a chain. So we have the outer link, we have the inner link. And the way that they're held together, there's a pin that slides through and holds the inner link and the outer link. I'll separate my inner link. And you'll see in the inner link, there are these rollers that allow for movement. And these rollers have a little bit of a lip, right, that sit on there. And they're very much enclosed. And they kind of slide through. And the pin holds it in place. And if I can do this seamlessly, boom. Now my chain's back together. This is how a chain is made. Now think about that on a tiny little micro scale of this little chain right here. So what happens that we got to be careful about is little bits of debris, little bits of metal, little bits of gunk get into the roller, get into the pin, and with all that friction start to wear down the interior of the chain. This is how chains wear out. What happens is they basically hollow out from the inside because all of this movement and all of the rolling, if I can get the roller to move, yeah, all of these rollers moving, we're talking a lot of movement, a lot of friction. So what we've got to do is make sure that the interior of the chain is clean. I don't really mind the outside of the chain. There's not much that the outside of the chain is really hitting. And to be honest, if it wears out from the outside, I mean, it's, well, you need to replace it anyway, but it's not the concern. The concern is the interior, to think about all of that movement. And to remember that all of your wattage from your body and your legs is being translated sometimes in just one or two links when you're changing gears. So be very mindful of that. This is a really good explanation as to just how minute some of these concerns can be. So the be all end all for the C is you got to keep your chain clean and lubricated. This is a very easy process that you'll need to really get good at and take a little bit of patience with. It's a 4-step process. The first step is you wipe down your chain. Get as much gunk off as possible. Second step is you apply lubricant on every link, just where the 2 links meet. That's where you want it, every link. The third step, run the chain, maybe go on a bike ride, maybe run it backwards, let it sit 15 minutes, let it soak through, and it will flush out the crud that's in the inside of the chain. That's the third step. And the fourth step, wipe it down again. So again, it's a wipe, lube, wait, wipe, 4-step process. Pretty basic. Let me show you though. So the way that I'll clean it off, so I'm just like getting chain grease on my computer. Just for demonstration purposes, I'll start with a clean white rag and I'll hold the bottom and I'll rub the bottom. Sometimes I'll pedal backwards actually, and it kind of moves the chain, or I can pedal forward, just making sure I don't get my fingers caught in the spokes. And I could do this all day long, and you'll just see the crud that comes off. I might also clean off the pulley wheels, these little pulley wheels here. I might spin those and clean those off. If I really wanted to, I'll get to my teeth here and kind of wipe those down. But the idea is I could spend all day making this white rag black. Not really gonna do it for you here, but just make sure that you run through, putting a little tension on. And again, if it drops, all you gotta do is pedal forward and your chain resets itself. You'll see some of the crud that starts to come off. All of that is excess stuff you really gotta clean. So, second step, chain lube. I've got 2 types of chain lube here. These are both from the Pedros brand. There's a couple of different brands you can look for, but make sure it's bike specific. I have thinner stuff, which looks a little bit more like olive oil. and I have thicker stuff, which is more viscous. And this stuff is made for rain, for wet purposes, because it lasts a little longer. This stuff is a little bit thinner. This stuff acts a little bit more like a solvent. It'll flush through the chain. This stuff lasts a little longer. There's benefits to each depending on what type of riding you're doing. If you're doing the thinner stuff, you might need to apply it a little bit more often. And I mean the difference between like 8 weeks versus 6 weeks. It's not like it's an everyday thing. And the thicker stuff, you might just need to be a little more mindful of wiping off the gunk because it adds a little bit more thickness, which you want to make sure you clean off the chain. So I'll do the thin stuff. And again, second step is literally just trying to get one drop in every, where the chain links meet, just one drop. Sometimes I'll kind of put my rag underneath to catch it. There's two different ways that I do this, depending on the type of person you are, I recommend. We have the type A people. If you're a type A person, great. You're meticulous. I really appreciate that. You're going to be one drop, one drop, one drop, one drop. That's fine. Then there's the type B people who just take a little steady stream and pedal and assume that it's going to be distributed throughout. But again, all you need to do is get it where the chain links meet. That's the only chain lube that's necessary. Once you've applied the chain lube into every link, you want to run the chain. You might want to let it sit for 5 minutes, 15 minutes. You might want to go on a bike ride, actually, and let it work its way through. And then the last step, again, is just the same as the first. You just wipe it down. And after applying the lubricant, you'll see, it's a little hard to see here, but a lot more stuff starts to come off. And again, all of this stuff is excess, is extra. Don't worry about wiping off too much grease because the only grease you really need is in the inside of the chain. Anything you're wiping off is excess. So don't worry about wiping it off too much. You can't have too clean a chain. So again, wipe it, lube it, wait, and wipe. And that's really all you need to do to a chain. Every so often, your chain will wear out. You'll need to replace it. If it's skipping on you, especially when you're pedaling forwards and it skips over teeth, you're going to want to bring it to a bike shop for analysis. But what you're going to want to do at home, every so often, maybe once a month and every 2 months, once after like a very rainy week you were riding on, is clean and lubricate your chain. Once your chain is clean and lubricated, you're going to have a lot easier time shifting. You're actually going to have a lot easier time with the power transfer to make sure that you go. So again, with the chain, the biggest thing is that if it falls off, put it back on and make sure it's clean and lubricated. That's the C. All right, I know I'm running up on my time, so I'm going to follow up with the quick release levers. The last point here is just make sure that you're really good about the quick release levers and you're checking to make sure that they're closed. If there's any wiggle to it, if there's any flexibility, or if your wheels feel loose, go to a bike shop and make sure that the gasket and the spring mechanisms are doing okay. They do wear out. It's rare that you'll need to replace them, but it's easy to replace. It's a cheap part. But if these are open, because maybe you parked at a bike rack and somebody jostled your bike, you need to be pretty clear about making sure that it's closed and that your wheels and your seat are stable. So in closing, one more time for the ABC check. Squeeze the tires, make sure they feel good. Squeeze the brakes, make sure that they lock out. And then check the chain, pedal backwards, make sure there's no clicking. Lift up the rear wheel. Make sure there's no rubbing when you spin. Maybe spin that front wheel too, make sure there's no rubbing. And then do a quick diagnostic on the quick release levers to make sure that they're solid on your bike. And you're going to want to do this literally every single time before you hop out. All right. I realize that was a lot. My apologies if we kind of burned some folks out, but hopefully we can follow up. But with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to stick around and take a couple of questions.
Great. We did have a couple of questions. 1 second, I just closed the chat. How long in time or miles would you recommend changing the chain?
It really depends on how it wears out. So a bike shop will actually be able to measure a chain and can see what's called chain stretch, which is a misnomer. It's really just a worn out chain. If you're ever skipping forwards, then it's a symptom that it needs to be changed. And I ride through at least a chain a year. So, I mean, I go through chains. And your chain will last longer if you clean it because there's less debris in there. So yeah.
What are your thoughts on chain cleaners that insert the chain in and let the cleaner
Cool.
sponges, brushes, and solvents do the work?
Those are great. Cleaning a chain with a solvent, though, is only one step of the process. You also have to re-lubricate it afterwards. So if you can imagine this chain link, if I clean out all the debris inside of here, it actually leaves gaps in the chain that need to be filled with lubrication. If you just use a solvent like WD-40 or a degreaser, what happens is you do get the gunk out, but then air gets in there and moisture gets in there and it actually attracts rust. So after you do a solvent and clean it out, you then also have to put the lubrication. So I combine both steps typically, and I just use like something like this, which acts as a solvent and a lubricant. But like the chain pig or the chain cleaner that does like some brushes and some really greasing, that's all well and good. But then the second step, which is sometimes forgotten, is to then grease that chain up afterwards, still with that 4-step process like I mentioned.
A lot of people really love that prop, by the way.
Yeah, thanks.
Can you remove the chain and soak it overnight in paint thinner and gasoline? Sort of related.
Yes, you can. Same thing though. It compromises it unless you reapply lubricant. It's a little worrisome if the chain is worn out and you clean off everything. So like with kerosene or something, you're making more space inside the chain, which again, unless you grease it pretty severely, then it could attract rust, which then compromises the steel.
In what direction should the quick release levers point, and does it matter?
It doesn't quite matter so much. There has been some talk. So if you look at my mountain bike levers, I have them pointing up. And the reason is that it's a little hard to see here, if I flip this whole thing this way and I had it pointing down to close and I run over a stick or some other thing that could pop it open, that could be a concern. I don't think there's much in terms of how it's designed though, like I think that's just more of a fear and less of an actual practicality. But my recommendation, if I had to give one, is to align the quick release lever so it's closed, lined up with what's called the fork right there. Because then you know that any debris or rocks or sticks or something won't accidentally open it up.
And then any recommendations for affordable bikes for older folks?
Ooh, good question. Bike shops. Go to a bike shop and test ride. You're going to want to test ride a few bikes. They're going to tell you the difference between the size or the models or the gearing or the weight. There's so many different varieties of the bikes. Every bike's got an ABC for the most part, but there's so many different types of bikes. And the best way to understand it is to like literally go on 15-minute or 20-minute test rides at a bike shop, which I know is weird right now, or tough right now, I should say, because of sanitization practices. But most bike shops are pretty good about their COVID practices. So yeah, that's my recommendation. But to answer the question, I would say like most casual riders who are just getting into it, they ride what's called a quote hybrid bike, which is an upright bike for the most part, but thinner wheels, so it's more efficient, and fully gears.
Cool. The last one was just could you show the bottle a little bit more clearly of the solvent lubricant? I think, or maybe, and just tell us what the name of it is. So
So this is, the brand is called Pedros. I appreciate them because most of their stuff is biodegradable. So it doesn't have like the neurotoxins that some other type has. This is, it's called Sin Lube. It's a thicker one, and you'll see it's a wet lube on there, made for rainy season. It really is a preference though. Some people like what's called rock and roll, which is a very thin lubricant, which acts as a lube, but also a really good solvent. And that's made for more drier conditions. Let's see, you can also get an ice version. Ice wax is one. So if you're like a winter rider, you can get a wax-based lubricant, which actually lasts the longest of them all, but it doesn't quite get into to clean things out like this is. But yeah, Pedros is just a brand that I have on hand. And again, it's biodegradable for the most part. I think this is biodegradable. Most of their stuff is biodegradable, which I really appreciate.
Okay, no other questions came in except for a lot of thank yous. Thank you so much, Galen, for an excellent program. Everyone really seemed to learn a lot. We really
Great.
appreciate your time. And if anyone has any feedback for the Chelmsford Library about how this presentation went, please send those my way. And the recording should be made available soon. So thanks very much, Galen.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate it. And I do want to remind people that it is Bike Month, even though we are all in our homes. But if you could, I don't know, just keep the encouragement going, talk about riding, and keep in touch with MassBike. We've got plenty more opportunities for us to touch base. So
Yeah,
I really
check
appreciate
out
Chelmsford Library.
Yeah.
And I hope you enjoy the Bruce Freeman out there. It's a gorgeous day for a ride.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right, bye. Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.